This video is on speciation. So Miss Forney did 2 videos reviewing natural selection and mechanisms for evolution, so how evolution occurs. And this video is on speciation, which is on the back of that big sheet. So speciation is the evolution of a new species. So the first term we really have to look at is this idea of a species. What makes up a species? If you look at 2 populations of human beings or 2 populations of a specific type of red-tailed hawk, how do we know that they're part of the same species? How do we know when when 2 populations have split into new species? So the first term we'll look at is this idea of species. So a species, the scientific definition for a species is a population whose members can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. Okay, so all of these terms are incredibly important. Interbreed, right, means they can mate together and produce viable, fertile offspring. That means they can have children who are living, right, and who can produce their own children. Okay, so if we look at these 2 birds right here, we have the eastern meadowlark and the western meadowlark. Okay, they look similar, however, their songs and behaviors are different enough that it prevents interbreeding. So they cannot interbreed, and they will not produce viable, fertile offspring. Thus, they are part of 2 different species, whereas all of these humans here can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So this idea of a species is a population of organisms who can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. So then again, this idea of speciation is this idea where different populations split and evolve into new species that can no longer interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. So the most important part of this is this idea of a reproductive barrier. So we're going to speak generally about how speciations can occur, and then we're going to look at more specific examples. So let's start over here. What are these clouds? These clouds are supposed to represent populations of the same species. So if we're looking at each of these clouds, okay, each is a population of the same species. So here's population 1, here's population 2, and here's population 3. And at this point, they're all a population of the same species. Now, as generations pass, these populations are going to reproduce, okay, but more importantly, they're going to be able to exchange genes between the population. Because if an individual from population 1 breeds with an individual from population 2, there's going to be an exchange of genes when the egg and the sperm unite. When fertilization occurs, there's a zygote that develops into an embryo and eventually an organism. Okay, there's going to be an exchange of genes here. There's going to be an exchange of genes between individuals in population 2 and individuals in population 3. There's going to be an exchange of genes between individuals in population 1 and individuals in population 3. So this exchange of genes was discussed in the video on mechanisms of evolution. And this is the idea of gene flow. As interbreeding occurs, okay, genes are exchanged. Okay? And this is important because over time, variations can build up in the population. Mutations and natural selection, as well as genetic drift, can lead to a buildup of different variations in the population. If these variations are advantageous and they're selected for, we could have an adaptation, we could have evolution occurring here. Okay, so it's important that this interbreeding occurs because it keeps these populations passing these variations around so they stay part of the same species. Now, what happens if some sort of reproductive barrier is put into place? And by reproductive barrier, I mean one of these populations is separated from the other two populations. So for example, what if population 2 was separated by some sort of barrier from populations 1 and 3? And this separation could be a geographic barrier. It could be something like this population is separated from the other populations by a mountain range. It doesn't have to be a geographic barrier, however. There could be some sort of other reproductive barrier. For example, this population all of a sudden develops a different mating dance if they're birds than these two populations, and so these two populations no longer want to mate with this population. So it could be a behavioral separator, it could be a geographic separator. There's a lot of different reasons that this population could be reproductively separated. And we'll come back to all of those reasons in just a second. But again, I want to talk about this general process of how speciation could occur. So some sort of reproductive barrier is put into place. So now population 2 has become isolated from populations 1 and population 3. Okay, so they're isolated. Populations 1 and 3 are still interbreeding. So we still have gene flow down here. So as variations build up in this population, and as variations and mutations build up in this population, they're still interbreeding and they can pass these variations around. Population 2 has been reproductively isolated, and none of these organisms are breeding with organisms in these populations. Okay? And that means that any mutations that build up here are not going to be shared with these populations down here. Okay. So what can happen? Well, over many generations, okay, there's going to be a buildup of mutations and variations that are different in population 2 as compared to populations 1 and 3. So here's my population 2, here's my populations 1 and 3. Okay, and again, 1 and 3 have been interbreeding this whole time, so they're still part of the same species. Now let's say population 2 is reintroduced to population 1 and 3. Okay, so some interbreeding occurs here, a couple generations down the line. Well, if organisms from population 2 can still interbreed with organisms from population 1 and 3, then guess what? These are still part of the same species. Okay, so they're still able to form hybrids there. Okay, they're still able to produce viable, fertile offspring, which means they're part of the same species. But let's say many more generations pass. And we have to keep in mind that population 2 has been reproductively separated, meaning they're not breeding with individuals in population 1 and 3, and they could also be experiencing different environmental selective pressures. So maybe different variations are helpful in population 2 as compared to population 1 and 3. Okay, so let's say like it's a mouse population, and light-colored mice, that gene is advantageous in population 2, but darker colored mice, that gene is more advantageous, and that trait is more advantageous in populations 1 and 3. So again, they could be experiencing different environmental selective pressures. And so now, as these mutations have built up, as the population changes, individuals in population 2 try to interbreed with individuals in population 1 and 3. But maybe now we have some hybridization issues. So maybe they can still produce offspring, but the offspring aren't as strong. They're very fragile. Or maybe the offspring are sterile, meaning they can't have children. Or maybe they have children that can have children, but the next generation is very weak. So there's some issues with, they're still part of the same species, but there's a breakdown in the ability for them to produce viable fertile offspring. Okay, so we have more generations and more mutations build up. Again, there's still gene flow between populations 1 and 3, but we no longer have gene flow between these two populations and population 2 up here. So over many generations, okay, maybe these two groups are brought back together. Well, now, when they try to mate, they can't. They can no longer interbreed and produce fertile offspring. At this point, we say speciation has occurred because they can no longer interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Okay, and so we say that the genes in population 2 and the genes in population 1 and 3 are no longer compatible to forming offspring. So speciation can occur. And speciation can occur through something called allopatric speciation or sympatric speciation. And in part 2 of this video, we'll discuss what kinds of reproductive barriers can create this separation for speciation to occur.